You ever look at a movie studio and think, okay, something clearly broke here? In the 1970s, that studio was Toho. This is the company that gave us Godzilla, controlled destruction, clear metaphors, monsters with rules. And then suddenly, haunted houses eating schoolgirls, soldiers time-traveling to the samurai era with machine guns, nuclear satire, apocalyptic despair, Japan literally sinking into the ocean. This is a decade where Toho seemed to lose any single identity and tried everything at once. So today, let's take a look at the films that prove one thing beyond a doubt. Toho went completely off the rails in the 70s. Let's kick things off with the one film that best illustrates just how far Toho had drifted by the late 70s, Hausu, or House, from 1977. On the surface, the plot sounds like something you've heard a million times. A young schoolgirl named Gorgeous and her 6 friends decide to spend summer vacation at her aunt's country house. But once you get inside that house, all bets are off. Creepy appliances come alive. A demonic portrait of a cat seems to watch your every move. Severed heads float through the air, and even a piano that literally devours one of the girls. The film plays like a child's fever dream realized on celluloid. Whimsical and colorful one second, outright bonkers the next. It uses everything from painted backdrops and collage effects to stop motion and early chroma key work, creating a visual language that feels both amateurishly chaotic and obsessively creative. Critics and audiences alike describe it as a psychedelic ghost tale, a stream of consciousness bedtime story, or like Scooby-Doo directed by Mario Bava. Here's the wild part. Toho originally wanted a movie like Jaws, a hit-driven commercial summer movie, and approached director Nobuhiko Obayashi with that idea. But Obayashi, an experimental filmmaker with a background in TV commercials and art films, didn't just reinterpret the assignment, he redefined it. When shaping the story, Obayashi didn't start with traditional genre beats. He asked his preteen daughter for inspiration. Many of the film's most surreal elements, like reflections attacking their owners or fears of piano keys biting fingers, came directly from her childhood nightmares. What makes Hausu even stranger is how unorthodox the whole production was for a major studio like Toho. Obayashi didn't work from a traditional storyboard. He essentially built the film scene by scene, shooting over a few months on one of Toho's largest sound stages and figuring things out as he went. The cast was mostly made up of young, relatively inexperienced actors, which only adds to the film's odd, dreamlike energy. Toho itself didn't have much confidence in the finished movie. Early critical reactions in Japan were largely negative, and it wasn't treated like a prestige release at all. But audiences, especially younger viewers, responded to it immediately. Hausu became a genuine box office hit, proving that whatever rules Obayashi ignored, he somehow tapped directly into the right wavelength. Decades later, his reputation only grew. When Hausu finally got an official North American release in the late 2000s through Janus Films and the Criterion Collection's Eclipse series, it found a new audience and cult classic status. Hausu isn't bizarre just for the sake of being bizarre. It represents a moment where Toho stopped chasing formulas and let pure creative instinct take over. And the result is one of the most singular cinematic experiences of the decade. After Hausu's ghostly nightmares, Toho's next big derailment takes us straight into feudal warfare with machine guns, helicopters, and a whole lot of moral ambiguity. G.I. Samurai, originally Sengoku Jietai, is a 1979 Japanese action sci-fi film about a group of Japan-ground self-defense force soldiers who get caught in an unexplained time slip and find themselves transported nearly 400 years into the past, right in the midst of Japan's Sengoku or Warring States period. The story kicks off during a training exercise when the unit is suddenly hurled into the 16th century. Before they even have time to process what's happening, they're under attack by samurai warriors, and it doesn't take long for things to get bizarre. Unlike most time travel movies that spend ages explaining the mechanics, GI Samurai jumps straight into the chaos. Modern weaponry is unleashed on traditional samurai forces, and the locals quickly realize these newcomers are not to be messed with. Some soldiers cling to the hope of returning home, others go AWOL, and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Yoshiaki Iba, played by the legendary Sonny Chiba, ends up forming an uneasy alliance with a powerful feudal lord named Nagao Kagetora. Together, they decide the best way home might just be to seize power in this fractured era. What's fascinating about the production is just how much of it had to be invented from scratch. The filmmakers originally asked the Real Japan Ground Self-Defense Force for cooperation on props and vehicles, but that partnership fell apart once the army read the script and saw that the soldiers go AWOL in the story. That meant the production had to build some of the military hardware, including the tank themselves. The movie doesn't just throw modern firepower into the past as a gimmick. It also looks at what happens when people with overwhelming advantage and no real purpose suddenly find themselves in a world that still operates by an entirely different set of rules. The SDF troops start out defending themselves, but as the story progresses, they become more immersed in feudal politics, some seeing the war-torn era as an opportunity to rewrite history and gain control. And let's be honest, part of the film's charm and chaos comes from the way it leans into spectacle. The firefights between automatic weapons and traditional arms, massive battle sequences, and the sight of a helicopter hovering over samurai camps are as absurd as they are thrilling. Critically, GI Samurai doesn't shy away from darker themes either. Morale breaks down, some soldiers commit heinous acts, and relationships with locals blur the lines between ally and enemy. This isn't a clean, heroic time travel romp. It's messy, morally uncomfortable, and spectacularly unpredictable. By the time the story reaches its final act, the movie stops feeling like a time travel adventure altogether and becomes something much darker. A meditation on power, technology, and what happens when history gives you permission to do whatever you want. Next up is one of the boldest films Toho distributed in the late 70s, and arguably one of the decade's most audacious cinematic ideas, The Man Who Stole the Sun. Directed by Kazuhiko Hasegawa and released by Toho in October 1979, this is a movie that blends thriller, black comedy, social satire, and outright absurdity in a way you just don't see in mainstream studio films. At its core, the story follows Makoto Kido, a seemingly disillusioned high school science teacher in Tokyo who does something completely unthinkable. He builds a fully functional atomic bomb from stolen plutonium and uses it to extort the Japanese government. His demands range from bizarre to cheekily self-important, like wanting unrestricted broadcasts of baseball games or permission for the Rolling Stones to play in Tokyo. And they escalate in unpredictable ways that keep the authorities guessing at every turn. What makes this film truly stand out, beyond its outrageous premise, is how it balances political commentary, thriller intensity, and black humor. The screenplay was co-written by Hasegawa and American screenwriter Leonard Schrader, brother of Taxi Driver's Paul Schrader, blending sharp satire with a frantic, almost chaotic energy that mirrors its protagonist's unraveling worldview. The performances lean into the film's tonal shifts perfectly. Kenji Sawada, a rock star turned actor, plays Kido with equal parts charismatic rebellion and unsettling unpredictability, while Bunta Sugawara portrays the relentless detective pursuing him with gravelly intensity. Kimiko Ikegami pops up as Zero, a radio personality who becomes an unlikely accomplice and cultural amplifier of Kido's antics. There's also a production layer of wildness to the film itself. Hasegawa and his crew shot extensive sequences on the streets of Tokyo, sometimes without permits, capturing real crowds and spontaneous energy that give the film a gritty realism despite its implausible setup. Critically, the film was well received in Japan. It won awards, including Best Director at the Yokohama Film Festival for Hasegawa. And in a 2018 Kinema Junpo Critics poll, it was voted among the top Japanese films of the 1970s. Notable considering the decade's rich cinematic output. The Man Who Stole the Sun doesn't sit comfortably in any one genre. It's part political thriller, part black comedy, part social critique, and it keeps sliding between all of them on purpose. The idea of an ordinary teacher casually building a nuclear bomb isn't just meant to shock. It taps into a society still haunted by nuclear trauma, buried in bureaucracy, and increasingly obsessed with media spectacle. The end result is tense, funny, disturbing, and oddly prophetic all at once. Exactly the kind of movie that could only come from a studio like Toho in the late 70s, when nothing felt stable anymore and pushing boundaries suddenly felt safer than playing it straight. Next on our list is one of the most ambitious and controversial films Toho released in the 1970s, Prophecies of Nostradamus, a disaster epic where the end of the world doesn't happen with a monster stomp, it happens with everything going wrong all at once. Based on a 1973 bestseller by Ben Goto, the film was one of Toho's big attempts to ride the era's disaster movie boom. It intertwines the lives of a Japanese family who've passed down Nostradamus' prophecies for generations with a mounting series of catastrophes in the near future, from ecological collapse and famine to nuclear war itself. What's immediately striking is how seriously it takes its premise. Instead of a single, focused event, the movie literally throws everything at the audience. Earthquakes, floods, fires, famines, giant mutated creatures, and scenes of social breakdown that play out against a haunting score by electronic music pioneer Isao Tomita. Behind the scenes, the production was no less intense. Some effects scenes were reused from other Toho disasters like Japan Sinks, and others were created by dispersing diluted sulfuric acid over forests to show environmental devastation, a risky practical effect that once led to a massive fire on the studio lot. The film was one of Toho's most expensive projects of the decade, and it performed well at the box office in Japan upon its release in August 1974. But that wasn't the end of its story. After audiences complained about some of the more graphic depictions of radiation victims, including mutated humans, the studio briefly pulled the film and re-edited a few controversial scenes. Internationally, it was released under titles like The Last Days of Planet Earth, but many of the uncut and original versions remain rare or unofficial today, adding a layer of mystique around the movie among fans of cult horror and disaster cinema. Prophecies of Nostradamus is more than another end-of-the-world movie. It's a full-on apocalypse checklist that reflects the era's deep anxieties about environmental collapse, nuclear war, and social breakdown. It's enormous in scope and uncompromising in tone, and it pushed Toho into territory that was bleaker and more contentious than anything they'd tackled before. Like Hausu and GI Samurai, it shows a major studio willing to take big, messy swings, even if some of them ended up burning down part of their own back lots. Another monumentally wild entry in Toho's 1970s output is Submersion of Japan, also known as Japan Sinks or Tidal Wave. This 1973 disaster epic was directed by Shiro Moritani and adapted from the best-selling novel Japan Sinks by Sakio Komatsu. It's one of the big spectacle films of the decade, and a perfect example of how far Toho was willing to go when it came to big ideas and big emotions. At its core, the story follows Dr. Tado Koro, a geophysicist who discovers that the Japanese archipelago is literally collapsing into the ocean due to a rapid shift in the Earth's crust, a geologic event with catastrophic consequences. So begins a decades-long countdown to national annihilation, as earthquakes, eruptions, and rising seas devastatingly reshape the country. The plot weaves together government crisis meetings, scientific debate, desperate evacuation strategies, and deeply human moments, including the romance between Onodera Toshio, a submarine pilot, and Abe Reiko. What makes the film especially compelling and unsettling is how it treats its disaster not as spectacle alone, but as a national trauma. Characters wrestle with impossible decisions: how to evacuate tens of millions of citizens, how to convince foreign governments to accept refugees, and how to reconcile pride with survival. The movie doesn't shy away from showing how political indecision and fear can complicate an already dire situation. Production-wise, this was a major undertaking for Toho. It was shot with elaborate sets and practical effects, including underwater sequences with the submarine Wadasumi 1 and dramatic imagery of the land literally breaking apart. The screenplay was written by Shinobu Hashimoto, a veteran responsible for classics like Rashomon and Seven Samurai, and the score was composed by Masaru Sato, giving the film both dramatic heft and emotional resonance. When it premiered on December 29, 1973, Submersion of Japan became a huge hit. It was the highest-grossing film in Japan for both 1973 and 1974, outpacing even The Godfather at the Japanese box office, a testament to just how much the disaster narrative resonated with audiences at the time. Internationally, it reached Western audiences in a very different form. Producer Roger Corman bought the US rights and released a heavily edited version with new scenes under the title Tidal Wave in 1975. A cut that trimmed much of the original's political and emotional weight in favor of more conventional disaster movie tropes. What makes Submersion of Japan worthy of our list is the way a major studio like Toho poured serious resources into a story about a nation literally ending. Not with monsters, but with unstoppable geological change. It taps into existential anxieties about technology, nature, and the fragility of civilization. And it does so on a huge, emotionally charged scale that was rare for Japanese studio cinema at the time. This isn't goofy surrealism or genre mashups. It's epic disaster with real emotional stakes. And it shows just how far Toho was stretching itself in the 1970s, creatively and thematically. Next up is a Godzilla movie that definitely deserves a place on this list. Not because it's just another monster fight, but because it takes the franchise in directions that are bizarre, psychedelic, and surprisingly blunt in message. Released by Toho in July 1971 as part of the Toho Champion Festival, Godzilla vs. Hedorah was directed by Yoshimitsu Banno, and it quickly became one of the most divisive entries in the entire Godzilla series. The film introduces Hedorah, a kaiju that originally arrives on Earth as a strange alien organism from space, but quickly mutates after feeding on industrial pollution. As it absorbs smog and toxic waste, it grows from a tadpole-like creature into increasingly grotesque and powerful forms, eventually becoming a towering sludge monster capable of spreading poisonous gas and devastating entire cities. A marine biologist and his young son witness the creature's threat firsthand and insist that Godzilla, traditionally the defender of Earth, will rise to confront this new ecological terror. As Hedorah grows, it begins to overwhelm humanity, forcing a confrontation that's as much a symbolic battle against pollution as it is a literal monster fight. What sets Godzilla vs. Hedorah apart from other entries, even other experimental Toho movies, is how confidently strange it gets. Director Banno and his creative team inject the film with surreal visual sequences that feel almost psychedelic, including animated interludes and fisheye montage shots that don't look like anything else in the franchise. The soundtrack swings wildly between rock, jazz, and eerie ambience. And the movie even dips into satire, poking fun at bureaucracy, counterculture movements, and humanity's slow response to environmental disaster. And just in case you needed one more sign that the rules were gone, this is the only Godzilla film where Godzilla actually flies, launching himself into the air using his atomic breath like a radioactive rocket. Critics at the time didn't quite know what to make of it. Many gave it negative reviews, and audiences were similarly mixed. But over the decades, it's become a cult favorite precisely because it feels unlike any other Godzilla movie. Even Hedorah's creation leaned into the theme. The monster's name comes from Hedorah, the Japanese word for sludge or slime, and it was intentionally designed to represent humanity's toxic legacy rather than a natural creature. There were even plans for a sequel, Godzilla vs. Hedorah 2, that would have taken the smog monster to Africa, but internal pushback at Toho eventually killed the project. Hedorah's suit itself was unusual too, heavy, layered, and difficult to perform in. Brought to life by Kenpachiro Satsuma, who would later become one of the franchise's most iconic suit actors and worked hard to make the creature feel unnatural and alien. What earns Godzilla vs. Hedorah a place on this list isn't just its environmental message, but the way that message is delivered. Instead of a straightforward monster brawl, we get surreal imagery, genre bending between horror, satire, and kaiju action, and a tone that swings from serious to absurd and back again. It's exactly the kind of creative risk a studio takes when it's already in the middle of rethinking what its films can be. Between monster mayhem and apocalyptic spectacles, Toho also took an unexpected detour into classic gothic horror with what fans now call the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, 3 loosely connected vampire films released during the early 1970s. All were directed by Michio Yamamoto and share a vampire theme, even though they don't follow a single storyline from start to finish. The trilogy consists of The Vampire Doll from 1970, Lake of Dracula from 1971, and Evil of Dracula from 1974. Unlike most Toho films that featured kaiju or big-budget spectacle, these movies wear their influences on their sleeves, drawing heavily from British and American Gothic horror traditions, especially the classic Dracula lore that dominated the genre in the 50s and 60s. The first entry, The Vampire Doll, also known as Legend of Dracula, starts quietly and creepily. A man goes missing after visiting his girlfriend's isolated mansion, prompting her sister and fiancé to investigate. What they find is more supernatural dread than monster action. A haunted house, tragic secrets, and a sinister presence that blurs the line between ghost and vampire. It's notable for blending Western vampire tropes with elements of Japanese ghost story tradition, incorporating eerie atmospherics and a slow burn sense of dread rather than jump scares. The second film, Lake of Dracula, shifts the setting to a remote lake and introduces a more literal vampire figure, one explicitly tied to European legends of Dracula, though handled with that distinctive Japanese twist. Its visual style leans heavily on Gothic mansion imagery and atmospheric tension, even as the plot occasionally dips into weird or melodramatic territory. The final film in the trilogy, Evil of Dracula, brings the vampire threat to an all-girls school, where an outsider uncovers a secret that's as creepy as it is sinister. While each movie stands on its own, they share a fascination with vampire mythology, haunted locales, and a certain old-world chills approach that was unusual for Japanese studios at the time. What makes this trilogy interesting and a bit off the rails in the context of Toho's usual output is how intentionally it leans into Western Gothic horror influences at a time when Japanese genre cinema was mainly known for kaiju and folklore-based ghost stories. In fact, the trilogy reflects Toho's attempt to tap into the global popularity of vampire cinema in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly films from Hammer and American horror studios, but filtered through a Japanese cultural lens that gave it a different flavor. Modern audiences and genre enthusiasts have rediscovered these films thanks to releases like Arrow Video's Blu-ray box set, which includes all 3 movies along with new commentary and restored visuals, helping cement their cult status outside Japan decades after their initial runs. These aren't kaiju and they're not apocalyptic spectacles, but that's exactly the point. The Bloodthirsty Trilogy shows Toho stretching into almost every genre imaginable, including Western-style gothic horror. Rather than playing it safe with familiar tropes, the studio produced atmospheric, stylistically bold vampire tales that stood out from anything else in their slate. They're moody, eerie, and sometimes uneven, but they're also a reminder that Toho's creative risks in the 70s weren't constrained to giant monsters or sci-fi madness. Now let's talk about a very different kind of film. Not a genre movie, not a big spectacle, but a radically personal and experimental drama from one of cinema's greatest auteurs, Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa's Dodes'ka-den is nothing like you'd expect from the guy who gave us Seven Samurai and Rashomon. It's his first film in color, it came at a turbulent point in his career, and it's a story that unfolds in a way that feels almost improvised compared to traditional studio fare. Instead of heroes or monsters, Dodes'ka-den follows the interwoven lives of a group of people living in a slum on the outskirts of Tokyo, a place where every day is a struggle and everyone clings to their own small dreams and fantasies just to get by. You meet a boy who imagines himself as the conductor of an imaginary tram, chanting Dodes'ka-den, the sound of the tram on the tracks, and pretending it runs through the junkyard he calls home. Couples who swap partners and make do in colorful, chaotic arrangements. A father and son who dream of a better life even as reality drags them down. A young woman trying to survive a terrible family situation. There isn't a conventional plot. It's more like a series of character sketches, each revealing a little about hope and despair, fantasy and survival. This movie marked several firsts for Kurosawa. It was his first color film, shot in standard 35mm rather than the widescreen formats he'd favored before. It was also his first feature in 5 years, produced under the banner of the short-lived Yonki no Kai, a collective he formed with fellow directors to try to reinvigorate Japanese cinema. Kurosawa mortgaged his own house to help finance the film, and despite being completed ahead of schedule and under budget, it failed at the Japanese box office, leaving him in debt and contributing to a deep personal crisis, including an attempt at ending his own life the following year. The film shifts between tragic and transcendent, often using color in striking ways to contrast the characters' grim realities with their rich inner lives and dreams. So why include a film like Dodes'ka-den among examples of Toho's creative unraveling? Because this isn't genre filmmaking, this is a major auteur reckoning with reality. It's a studio release that feels personal, raw, and uncertain. It captures a director at a crossroads, both artistically and personally, producing something unusual for a major Japanese studio. This isn't a blockbuster, a monster movie, or a sweeping disaster, but it does show a major creative voice pushing against boundaries and expectations at a time when Toho itself was exploring new paths. That makes it a perfect capstone to the story of a studio searching for inspiration in the 1970s. Looking back at these films, it's clear Toho didn't just have a weird phase in the 70s. They were experimenting, panicking, searching, sometimes all at once. From surreal haunted houses to time-traveling soldiers, nuclear satire, apocalyptic despair, gothic vampires, and deeply personal dramas, this was a studio trying to redefine itself in a changing film world. Some of it was messy, some of it was brilliant, and all of it was fascinating. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments, which Toho film from the 70s blew your mind the most?